Hey all, it's come to my attention that we've just hit 1,500 subs. While it's still early days and this might seem like low numbers to some, to me this is crazy and means so much. Thank you all for subscribing, sharing and engaging with the content, and look forward to plenty more coming in the future. I know that this channel can continue to grow and I'm happy to have such an awesome community along for the ride. And if you are new to the channel, I hope you enjoy this video and all the videos here and consider sharing and subscribing yourself. Either way, I just wanted to say thanks. Now, enough with this sentimental bullshit, let's talk about Warhammer. It's no secret that the Warhammer and Warhammer 40k licenses have been used somewhat liberally in the video game space in recent years. Indeed, any quick search on Steam will illustrate just how bad the problem is right now, and just how difficult it can be to sort through such a monumental trash pile to find any prospective diamonds in the rough. But this isn't to say that there are no good games that bear the Warhammer branding. In fact, quite the opposite, and while many of them may be obscured behind mountains of lackluster entries, there are some genuinely excellent Warhammer and Warhammer 40k games out there, just waiting to be experienced. So, with this in mind, I thought, why not make a video highlighting some of the stronger entries? Now, full disclosure, these are not organised in order of quality, they're just 5 good games that I would recommend for fans or newcomers. Also, in this video, I'll just be covering 40k. I may do another video for fantasy at some point, depending on how this one goes. Maybe let me know in the comments if that's something you guys would like to see. Lastly, it goes without saying that I've not yet played every single Warhammer 40,000 game out there, or even all those readily available currently. This in turn means that there may be some favourites or quality entries that I simply haven't gotten to yet, or have missed over the years. So sorry in advance if I miss out your favourite. It's nothing personal, I swear. With all that said, let's just fucking get on with it. When it comes to picking out great games bearing the 40k brand, few conversations are had without the original Dawn of War being mentioned. Developed by Relic Entertainment and published by THQ, Dawn of War would release in September of 2004 to widespread critical and commercial acclaim. Set on the Imperial planet of Tartarus, the story follows the Imperium Space Marine Blood Ravens chapter as they are deployed to initially deal with a large orc invasion force. From here, things progress and develop as more races and threats are added to the mix, and it all culminates in an interesting tale which, while a little formulaic for any 40k fan, nevertheless still does a great job of selling its story through its mission structure and general narrative design. Gameplay-wise, the first Dawn of War is by far the most traditional RTS of the franchise, and one of the most traditional RTS games to utilise the 40k IP full stop. Players must build up their bases and forces, monitor and micromanage resources, and move moderately sized armies around a large map to accomplish various objectives. These objectives range from reaching a point on the map to defending areas to winning large-scale battles as the campaign progresses and the difficulty ramps up. When it comes to criticisms, there are really only 2 major offenders that can be cited. Firstly, upon the game's launch, it came under some criticism for its campaign only having 1 playable faction. While this may seem like a bit of an odd critique, especially when considering that other races were still playable in the game's multiplayer on launch, its launch date's close proximity to the likes of Warcraft 3, which had lent into the notion of a multiple faction campaign, increased the audience's expectations in this area. Secondly, while this hurts to say, some of the game's elements have aged a little, including its graphical fidelity, animation work, and voice acting.
You wanted to face the Imperium's greatest warriors, the Space Marines.
However, I am careful to say some, as many of these elements do still hold up outside of the game's in-engine cutscenes, which are, to be honest, the real offenders in this regard. Still, I mention this really to remind prospective players that this game was released in 2004, and not to illustrate that these elements were weak at the time. In fact, when Dawn of War was first launched, it was undeniably top tier in its presentation, and so this criticism is more one that can be attributed to the ravages of time than it can to the game's actual development. Fortunately, the first of these 2 major criticisms was fixed by the game's 3 expansions, Winter Assault, Dark Crusade, and Soulstorm, all of which added new faction campaigns and multiplayer races. The second has been mediated by a lively modding community, which has also added new game modes to Dawn of War's already excellent multiplayer, as well as upgrades and tweaks in many areas, continuing to add to an already large and multifaceted experience. In short, Warhammer 40,000 Dawn of War showed an entire generation of PC gamers what a great 40k game could be, and convinced many of the validity of moving proceedings off the tabletop and onto their desktop. While it may have aged a little in places, and also may require the odd mod here and there or expansion to reach its full potential, few can argue with the level of quality shown even by its base release. Indeed, such a high bar would be set by Relic's seminal RTS that future 40k games in the genre would be compared, and many still believe it to be the best use of the license to date. With such critical and commercial success seen by its predecessor, it came as little surprise to fans that a sequel was in the works. Once again developed by Relic and published by THQ, Dawn of War 2 would be unleashed onto the world in February of 2009, and it would bring with it division among fans of the first entry. Beginning its tale on the desert planet of Calderas, the player once again takes control of a group of space marines as they take on orc hordes and other more mysterious threats. All in all, much like the first game, the story is solid 40k fare, with enough twists and turns to keep the player invested, whether they're familiar with the IP or not. However, despite it seeming like a similar tale on the surface, Dawn of War 2 in many ways is a vastly different beast from its predecessor. Firstly, bases and base building have been completely removed. This in turn means the player chooses a small group of Space Marines at the start of each stage, which comprises their entire force throughout the mission in question, placing a focus on RPG upgrade mechanics and trading large-scale tactical deployment for small team coverage and one versus many game design. While this changes the scale and balance of the conflicts, it also means that the campaign takes on a more linear quality, with more of the game's mission objectives tying in with this concept. Secondly, Relic pushed in its advertising that the campaign was completely playable co-op, along with the game's horde-like Last Stand modes. Once again, this allowed for a different gameplay experience than that seen in its predecessor. Taken together, all of this creates an experience that stands on its own, separately from the game that came before. It may not be the traditional sequel that fans were expecting, but in some ways, that's more commendable, as creating something brand new that can elicit just as much enjoyment, albeit for different reasons, is no easy feat. Moreover, such design philosophies are not arbitrary and actually serve to reinforce the narrative concepts seen within 40k. For every one Space Marine, hundreds if not thousands of enemies are slaughtered in Dawn of War 2. And it doesn't take long to realise when looking at 40k's lore and history that this is how it should be. Also, Dawn of War 2 would release several substantial standalone expansions in the form of the Chaos Marine-based Dawn of War 2 Chaos Rising and the multiple faction comprising Dawn of War 2 Retribution, both of which can be enjoyed completely separately from the base game, despite a narrative through line meaning continuing from previous entries is recommended. Despite releasing in 2009, Dawn of War 2 has held up pretty well, in no small part due to its much narrower set-piece design compared to its predecessor. Also, having benefited from the progression seen in graphical fidelity in the industry as a whole since its predecessor, it's hard to argue that Dawn of War 2 isn't a much better looking game. However, due to its linear, smaller scale conflicts and co-op focus over large scale battles, its community remains much smaller today and makes it arguably a more suitable game for players looking for a solid campaign or co-op experience, rather than a long-tailed, multiplayer-driven mod fest. While like many others I was initially hoping for a more traditional sequel to the excellent Dawn of War, Dawn of War 2 won me over by succeeding on its own terms. While its different direction and vastly altered design and gameplay style may not be for everyone, the developers' refusal to take the easy road by making a more formulaic sequel was a bold and interesting one, which in turn led to the creation of another great Warhammer 40,000 game. Couple this with some excellent expansions and a palpable focus on the reinforcement of 40k's narrative scale and themes, and what you have is another game worth checking out for anyone who loves 40k or thinks it might be a universe worth exploring. Warhammer 40,000 Inquisitor Martyr was a real surprise for me. Going in, I wasn't sure what to expect from what was clearly a high-concept, mid-tier budgeted game, which was seeking to establish or at least progress its own subgenre, the tactical ARPG. However, what I ended up experiencing was a game that, for all its flaws, tried to accomplish something different and original, all while paying great respect to the 40k world and its rich, vast lore. Taking place primarily aboard the titular Martyr, a huge, seemingly abandoned warship which re-emerges from the warp after around a 5,000-year absence. The story progresses from here in many interesting and varied directions, and also manages to hold its fair share of surprises, especially for fans of 40k lore. While it does feel a little limited by the game's budget on occasion, the tale told somehow balances lower-key storytelling with large-scale ramifications, making it feel both appropriately small, yet in keeping with the universe's heavy and near constant focus on large scale. In terms of gameplay, while this may look initially like a 40k-style Diablo clone, closer inspection and only a few minutes worth of playing tells a different story. Unlike Diablo, or indeed many other ARPGs out there, Martyr instead leans heavily into the tactical part of its tactical ARPG mantra, prioritizing larger health pools, slower moving enemies, and the inclusion of elements like cover. While not all of these systems gel perfectly, and the infrequent vehicle sections are nothing short of terrible, the elements work well enough to create an interesting and original feel that elicits more deliberate and less reactive gameplay choices from its player. On top of this, the game also hosts a bunch of deep and interesting systems when it comes to character progression, crafting, and loot, many of which contain varied and original ideas of their own. While again, not every one of them is a hit, and some are more trouble than they're worth, the general consensus here is a positive one, and there is much to enjoy in your character's slow creep up the power scale. In terms of presentation, while it's clear that Martyr was not the most expensive game ever made, it makes the best of what it's got. And this is further compounded in no small part by the fact that a fair amount of the content takes place on board the Martyr itself, allowing for a liberal reuse of many of the game's art assets. Still, there are locations and biomes that the player visits outside of the Martyr, and such variety is welcome and well executed. Also, special commendation should be given to the wealth of potential content on offer here. Even without any of the game's larger and smaller DLC packs and standalone expansion, Warhammer 40,000 Inquisitor Prophecy. I really should get to that one day. There is at least 300 plus hours worth of content across all starting classes. While much like other games in its genre, such a hefty time investment will only be undertaken by those who find its gameplay loop extremely addictive, such a large potential time sink should nonetheless be noted. Unlike many other developers that have held the 40k license in recent years, it's clear that Neocore Games cared about what they were making here, and such a fact is further proven by the game's near constant post-launch support, which is still being provided by its developer some 2+ years after the game's release. While it may have some issues, and cram in a few too many needless paid DLC options, its ambition, base length, and clear respect for the license in which it operates make it a game more than worth checking out. So we've talked about RTS games and the strengths and weaknesses of approaching that genre in different ways. And we've spoken briefly about the minutiae of the tactical ARPG as a notion and how it was attempted and for the most part executed by a passionate if somewhat underfunded studio. But now, let's fuck all that off and talk about good old-fashioned orc murder. Warhammer 40k Space Marine is somewhat of an outlier on this list. It doesn't attempt to tell a particularly deep or thematically poignant story, with a narrative that acts mainly as setup for a sequel that we will unfortunately probably now never see. It doesn't try and reinvent the wheel, and it doesn't try and reach beyond itself or transcend its genre. Instead, it takes what's good and distills it down to its purest form. This is a game about living the power fantasy of stepping into an Ultramarine's armor and wiping out a small population of enemies. And man, is it a blast. Players take control of Titus, the commander of a group of Ultramarines, who are dispatched to defend a Forge world from an Orc invasion. I'm noticing a pattern here with these Space Marine stories. While much like Dawn of War 1 and 2, the story progresses to encompass the usual thematic fare, including the temptation of chaos and various other elements that seem to make their way into almost all Space Marine stories in 40k. There are enough twists and turns to keep you mildly interested. And I say mildly interested, as it's clear that the story was never meant to be what kept you playing here. That task is firmly planted in the gameplay's wheelhouse. While gameplay mainly boils down to various types of mass murder, there are enough subtle systems at play to balance the experience out when it comes to Space Marine's design philosophies. First of all, there's a variety of weapons and other gadgets that you gain access to throughout the game, which serve to vary up the experience a little, such as the awesome jump pack sections or the odd turret section. Second, and most importantly, there's the health system, which is probably the element of Space Marine that becomes the most paramount in maintaining a balanced experience. Basically, after damaging an enemy enough, Titus is able to perform a finisher, which both give him some health back and also make him look super cool. This allows for a risk-reward system to develop, where the player needs to approach enemies in order to regain health, but may also get themselves killed easily while trying to do so. Do you charge in and take advantage of the execution icon hovering above a distant enemy's head now and get some health back, or wait for an enemy to get a little closer and hopefully minimise the risk? But how close? And won't he bring his friends? Even an Ultramarine can fall against too many orcs. All of these decisions are made in a split second as you succeed or fail against what is normally an extremely large and comically aggressive enemy force. Finally, the player also unlocks Fury Mode a little ways into the game, which essentially grants Titus greater melee damage and a health regen tick, allowing for yet another wrinkle or potential get out of jail free card in tight spots. However, despite the Ultramarines being one of the Imperium's most powerful weapons in the fight against its many enemies, the numbers are spectacularly in the enemy's favour, with only 3 Ultramarines sent to take out around 1 million orcs. Such odds mean it's easy to get overwhelmed and overconfident. All of this allows for just the right amount of challenge, especially in the game's first half, and keeps you feeling both powerful but wary of your enemies. In terms of presentation, Space Marine was always a solid effort, but nothing spectacular, and that really is how it remains. Sure, it doesn't look as good as some of its peers, but who cares when you can do this? Also, developer Relic Entertainment made the smart choice to hire high-end voice talent for many of the game's cast, including the likes of Mark Strong as Titus. Such a choice has allowed the voice acting to hold up well, and even show up some of its more modern contemporaries.
I must first recharge my energy.
However, as I'm sure you would expect from a game that prioritises fun over all else, Space Marine does have a few issues. First, its pacing is occasionally a little off and drags a bit in the middle, and its lack of focus on interesting themes or conflicts can make for some dull story elements. Second, it only has 2 boss battles, one of which is a QTE. And third, it never really progresses too much on a gameplay level. That last one isn't necessarily a criticism, it just means that if you like the game after an hour or so of playing, you're in for a fun time. If you don't, it never really does anything or changes enough that it's going to win you over. When it comes to 40k, there's a lot of large-scale, grandiose melodrama, which is often tied to the very themes at the heart of humanity's depiction as a slowly decaying and ultimately doomed element of the universe, destined to fight to its last breath in an ultimately pointless conflict. Warhammer 40,000 Space Marine offers some levity in such an oppressive world, and while it never betrays the IP's themes, and even engages with them to some extent, it puts fun gameplay above all else, and for that, it should be commended. If you like 40k, or you just want to destroy a ton of Xenos scum, there are not many better uses of 6 to 8 hours than a playthrough of Warhammer 40,000 Space Marine. We've spoken a lot so far in this video about Space Marines. While Martyr showed us things from the perspective of the enigmatic Inquisitors, it's clear that the many chapters of the Imperium's forces are often the focus when it comes to 40k games. However, for our last entry on the list, it's time to vary things up a little. While they may often work in unison with the Imperium, providing the much needed technology to deal with the ongoing threats to humanity, the Adeptus Mechanicus are very clear about their own lineage and their existence as an individual entity outside of the Imperium. This is just one reason why Warhammer 40,000 Mechanicus is my favourite 40k game in many years. The game begins as the titular Adeptus Mechanicus discover a lost transmission re-emerging from warp space. After discovering that the transmission is from a world known as Silva Tenebris, a planet once visited by the Adeptus Mechanicus long ago, they attempt to rediscover what lost knowledge and technologies could have been forgotten there. Unfortunately, while there is indeed lost technologies to be discovered, there is also more sinister threatening forces waiting in the wings. And by sinister and threatening forces, I mean a fuck ton of Necrons. Such a setup allows for interesting thematic and philosophical questions to be laced throughout Mechanicus' campaign, which are only augmented further if you're familiar with the lore and source material. Moreover, all of the dialogue is well written and well performed, helping to sell the game's concepts, despite its modest production budget. When it comes to gameplay, Mechanicus is sort of half Darkest Dungeon, half XCOM, but with some tweaks and differences which allow it to form its own identity. Players must navigate various procedurally generated tombs in an overworld map of sorts, and also partake in choose-your-own-adventure-style decision-making as various scenarios and impasses are discovered. Once you run into some foes, either on the overworld map or as a byproduct of a decision that you've made, you will then begin combat. Combat takes place on somewhat procedurally generated maps and utilises a grid system for movement and attacks, which any fan of XCOM or many other turn-based tactics games will be familiar with. Whilst in combat, you will be given either a single or a multitude of objectives, which include defeating all foes, surviving for so many turns, escaping the battlefield by reaching a certain location, or accessing a particular terminal. While these can get a little frustrating at some parts of the game, with too many objectives reverting to kill all enemies once you thought you were done escaping or surviving a number of turns, it's never enough to spoil proceedings. However, as well as various other twists on the XCOM formula, the main selling point in Mechanicus' fights is the way it handles combat turn order. Essentially, every unit has a currency called cognition points, or CP. CP can be gained or stacked either by defeating enemies, naturally as part of the turn, or from accessing certain terminals on the map. All movement and actions in combat require the use of CP, meaning that if utilised correctly, the player can chain together multiple actions or bank them for the next turn. On top of all of this, you have a whole lot of options when it comes to outfitting your units and choosing which lower tier soldiers to bring, adding yet more layers and wrinkles to proceedings. Finally, you have the awakening meter, the game's literal ticking clock element. Basically, without ruining too much, early in the game the Mechanicus accidentally begin to awaken not only the individual Necron tombs on Silver Tenebris, but the entire planet as they continue to search for answers and new tech. This level of awakening is literally represented in-game by several meters. The first is shown on each individual tomb and can go up and down depending on the player's actions. After its level increases, it will add a buff to the Necron forces or a debuff to the Mechanicus forces, add more enemies to a fight, or create another disadvantage for the player. The second is the entire planet's awakening meter, which instead indicates how long it will be until the entire planet wakes up and it's time to leave. Such an element really helps keep the pace up and the pressure high, especially when making decisions regarding which missions to take and which tech to salvage. Regarding presentation, Mechanicus nails pretty much every element, with both the Necron forces and the Mechanicus themselves looking like they've come straight off the tabletop. While it can be said that areas are a little samey, this is at least narratively sound given where the game's story takes place, and each area's multitude of potential traps and moving platforms also go a long way to mediate such a criticism. Finally, the jewel in Mechanicus' crown when it comes to presentation has to be its sound, both in terms of its design and its score. Seriously, this game sounds incredible, and has one of the best soundtracks of any Warhammer game I've ever played. Taken together, all of this creates an extremely enjoyable, extremely replayable, turn-based tactics game, which tells a story not often seen in the long and somewhat unvaried history of 40k games. In a world filled with stories about Space Marines, the corrupting influence of chaos, or an impending Orc invasion, it's great to see some other forces get some love, and both the Adeptus Mechanicus and the Necrons allow for some interesting themes and philosophies, as well as great game mechanics. While I said up top that this list was not in order of quality, and it's not, if I had to recommend one 40k game, it would probably be Warhammer 40,000 Mechanicus. And there you have it, 5 awesome 40k games available right now for you to enjoy. And proof that while the bad has seemed to outweigh the good in recent years, there are still diamonds in the rough. And who knows, with Games Workshop recently announcing they are looking to try and create more AAA experiences, and several new and interesting Warhammer games on the horizon, hopefully there'll be more to add to this list sooner rather than later. Also, I have some more in-depth reviews on the channel for several of these titles. I've added cards already throughout, but I'll link them in the descriptions below. Now, enough of this. It's time to find the next great undiscovered gem that's utilising the 40k license right now. What we got here? What's this? The Horus Heresy Betrayal. I like the Horus Heresy. Oh my god. What the fuck is this crap?